Assalamu alaikum, dear brothers and sisters. I'm your host, Mohamed Abbas Kirmani, and welcome back to another episode of They Ask You, brought to you by Blessed True Media. So, in today's episode, we'll be discussing Islam and the environment and whether Islam can help us with the current environmental crisis, where we'll be using Quranic teachings and hadiths from the prophets and the Imams to help us explore more into this topic. Now, to help us delve further into this intriguing discussion, we are honored here with Dr. Amina Inloes. She has a PhD in Islamic studies and is a popular Islamic lecturer who has lectured in many countries as well as on many Islamic television channels. Dr. Amina is the author of Women in Shiaism and is a very experienced editor and has edited many scientific journals and books. Dr. Amina, Assalamu alaikum, how are you?
It's a pleasure to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you here. Just before we start, I'd like to remind our audience that if you guys have any queries, questions, or any comments, you're welcome to drop it in the chat box below. Alternatively, you can use our other social media, such as Instagram and Facebook, for any queries or comments that you might have that's related to this discussion. Also, if you didn't manage to tune into last week's episode or any of the other episodes, you're welcome to do so by clicking on the channel below, and you'll be all caught up. Now, without further ado, I'd like to start with our first question and get into the show. So, Dr. Amina, when we think of the environmental crisis, I think most of us can sort of, in our minds, what the first thing that doesn't come to our minds is Islam when we think of environmental crisis. So, really, is the environmental crisis a religious or a secular issue? Like, in terms of, is there any place for discussion of religion in it at all?
As you say, this is something that depends a lot on the perspective of the person discussing it. I was listening to someone the other day, not a Muslim or on any sort of religious platform, who was saying the solution is going to be in science, like faith in the benevolence of human nature and concern for the poor and all of these things. And I was thinking, he's saying science, but science is, as we have it today, it's value neutral. And as we know, science can be used in some good ways, and it can be used merely to support corporate interests on the backs of the masses of the world, and at the expense of the environment. So what this person was actually saying was inherently, it was a religious sentiment. It was just being expressed by someone who no longer had faith in the organized religions. So I do think there is ultimately something. I don't want to say ideological, because that can be a very problematic word. But there is something that goes beyond the mere nuts and bolts of cause and effect, which tends to be primarily what science in this day and age treats. That plays into anything that happens on the broader social, political, geopolitical scale. And that does include how we live in the world, how we perceive the nature of the world, how we perceive our relationship with other people. Do we inherently believe that, it doesn't matter what happens to people in one country or another as long as it's not us? Or, do we believe in more equity? Do we believe that nature is just an object for us to do whatever we want to because it's an inanimate thing? Or do we believe it has a spiritual purpose and place in the cosmos? These are just a few things where, whether you call it religion or you call it something else, they are inherently questions that have been treated by religion, and Islam is no different. Islam has a heritage of viewpoints, especially found in the Quran and Hadith, about the earth, about nature, plants, animals, the cosmos, etc. And this is definitely one of the aspects of our tradition that I think is going to become even more important as we do approach the coming decades. It may have been neglected in the past century, but the past century was a bit of an errant century compared to a lot of the history of the Islamic tradition.
So thank you for that answer. And actually, just going into that further, when we're discussing Islam, if we go more into detail, what about the Quran? When we talk about the environmental crisis, how does the Quran portray the natural world?
Yeah, there are definitely a number of angles one could take with that, keeping in mind that the idea that there is a separation between the human made world and the natural world is a very modern idea. And one could actually question how true that is. I mean, we still live in nature. Even if I'm in central London or New York, it may not feel like nature and get those nice, green tree vibes in the Central Park or something. But it is inherently part of the natural world. My composition comes from things from the earth, and so does the composition of everything around me. But of course, we do feel there is a sort of division between the produced or the industrial versus the natural, which was not the case in the 7th century or really most other centuries. And so, the Quran isn't necessarily making a separation. I mean, yes, people have discussed what is the nature of nature. But among the things that would be pertinent, first of all, is there is the perception that every object or being in the cosmos has its primary function as the worship and recognition of Allah. But we simply do not understand it, as is said, for example, about the birds. So an animal, whether it's an animal in a field somewhere or in the ocean, a coral reef, an animal in the factory farming industry, its primary purpose is to worship and recognize Allah. And then, it does things in the ecosystem, in the food chain, and so forth. But that's an inherent level of respect that's not necessarily found by simply classifying something as an industrial product for human usage in a sort of desacralized context. Also, the inanimate objects too. We look at something like strip mining, for example. This is done again with a sense that these are just things, and they don't really matter because they're things. No, I'm deeply exaggerating because people do care about their where they live. But some of the corporate interests behind these things do have that mentality, which of course does extend to humans, and to acknowledge that the physical earth also, has some sort of awareness as a worshiper of Allah, or as, Allah says in the Quran that, Allah offered the trust to the earth and the heavens, and they rejected it. This verse, granted, there have been various tafsirs of it, because what does it mean for the earth to sit here and think about this question and give an answer? Is it metaphorical? Is it literal? But the point is, there is something greater going on with respect to stuff, like rocks and that sort of stuff, or cement for that matter, than that just being stuff. And that again leads back to a greater, if one genuinely embraces this worldview, to a greater appreciation and respect of the holistic spiritual value of the cosmos and creation. And I did sort of make a sort of side comment there, but just to unpack that, the way that we treat nature, so to speak, whether it be the physical earth, whether it be forests and so forth, animals, it very much relates to how we treat other people. I mean, the environmental crisis is not happening in some sort of vacuum where we've just, through no other fault of our own, managed to say consume too much food on Earth, for example. It's happened in main abuses is splitting basically the global population into a minority of consumers, maybe a growing minority of consumers, but people who have a big consuming power, and the people who are feeding the consumers. So the factory workers, miners, for that matter, the people who are doing the labor but not able to access the fruits of their labor on an equal plane. So you know, that inequity, which has been perpetuated over the past century on a very mass scale. I mean, it's always been there in history, but the way it's kind of been split across the world, I think, is new in our time. That very much does feed into what's going on, especially when we consider that, some of the things that there's no reason to limit it. I mean, I'm trying to tone this down so I don't sound like a revolutionary or something, but you know, capitalism and consumerism are responsible for this. And what I find quite sad is that it is an optional problem in many cases. Like I said, it's not just the case that we had to grow a lot of food and we hit our limit. You think about disposable plastics, especially for things that just, you don't need them for, like, wrapping on fruits, for example. It didn't have to happen. And there's no reason why it had to happen, except again, don't want to sound revolutionary, but corporate greed. And that again just ties into the ethos of how people are dealing with each other, and a sense of you know commodification of the human being, if you will, which we see in various ways as well. So what I'm trying to get at is the way we treat the world around us goes hand in hand with the way we treat each other. And religion, again, does address that. And I think in any decent religious tradition, and I'm not going to like point fingers, this one is decent and this one is not, but in any sort of established, wise religious tradition with something to offer humanity, which is most of them, um, that there is going to be the sense that foremost one aspect of spiritual development or enlightenment is to treat people with compassion and with dignity, treat others as you want to be treated. And this is something that has been lost in some of how the world has been approached on a physical level, and this is unfortunately the result that we have been seeing for a while. It's not something new. I think what's new in Europe, for example, is that we're seeing it a bit more directly right now, whereas it wasn't as much in front of us. And as people, unfortunately, we only take seriously the things we see in front of us, and not just Europe. I mean, of course, we have the floods in Pakistan, and we have many things going on. But if you look at places where, for example, they've been losing their water supply over the past decades, they've been seeing it already. It's just that now the concern is catching up in places where people actually see something, even if it's not extremely severe.
Yeah, thank you for that. Actually, I just picked up on one of the things that you said about how we don't need sort of like wrapping on fruit and wrapping on this. And we were learning about that in university. Like the example they put was a phone. You have a good phone, yet you'll just want to get the new phone. And then what do you do with that old phone? You just leave it in a drawer and it sits there and it wastes and all that kind of stuff. And it just shows that sometimes, we do live in like a wasteful society. Um, and I also like the point where you were talking about how if how we treat human beings, and I hope we all treat human beings with decency and respect. If we did the same with our natural world, I think things would be a bit different. But I think back to the point of the food chain where I think obviously human beings see themselves, on the top, and then inanimate objects, plants are all below. So, according to the Quran and Hadith, do we have sort of free license to do whatever we want with the plants and animals in this sense, or at liberty, or no?
That is a good question, and I would say no. It's not that we can't do anything with it. We oftentimes speak of Islam as a religion of balance. Um, in any case, we are, we're allowed to farm and to eat meat, respectfully eat meat, and so forth. But there are also some things that are mentioned in the Quran and Hadith which do draw a line. One of them in the Quran being the teachings on israf or wasting, which is very interesting, by the way. I know this is like a little bit off topic, but if you actually look through the teachings on israf, you do find there is a very heavy theological push connecting the wasting of God's blessings with shaitan and shayateen, which is something, I feel like sometimes we sort of push aside these theological aspects when talking about subjects that are supposed to be more secular or more scientific. But basically, Allah is connecting the wasting of divine blessings or the wanton destruction of divine blessings, which, in my opinion, would include things like unnecessary deforestation or, killing an animal needlessly, for example, is condemned in the traditions. That this is somehow basically related to Satanism, which is a heavy thing. Conversely, be a little bit more revolutionary. This might suggest that those entities, which by that I mean like corporate entities, perhaps, or political entity, that sort of thing, which would try to plan their strategy in such a way to make people waste things, like, for example, having a computer that breaks on the very day the warranty expires. I wonder which one of us that could be that's dealing with that. And I'm not joking, the warranty is expiring today. Um, so you have to buy a new one, especially given everything that goes into the production of electronics, and for that matter, the distribution and assembling of electronics. You know, it's suggesting that is an act of shaitan. It's not just someone's making a bad decision, like God forbid, oversleep for Fajr prayers. I mean, that could be an act of shaitan too, but there's a number of sort of natural causes and things that aren't quite as charged. So there is an actually very severe condemnation of israf if you look at that. But the point is, we are allowed to make use of the blessings that Allah has given us, within the limits of what is halal, but not to be excessive or wasteful. That's a big line in the Quran. Within the Hadith, there's a number of things that are mentioned to this effect. I'll just mention a few. One of them being it's related from the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and this is a very heavy statement. That if the oppression you have committed towards animals is forgiven you, then you have been forgiven for a lot of your sins. Like that's heavy. I mean, this is,
Yeah.
I don't want to actually get into the trope of, hey, Islam had animal rights back in the 7th century, because, I feel like sometimes we get a bit defensive when we start, like, pushing that line. But I just want to point out that back in the 7th century or even the 17th century, the types of things that people did to animals were not nearly as bad as they were now. I mean, yes, people would sometimes hit their riding animal and, so forth. I'm not saying everyone would care for their animals nicely, but, you wouldn't see some of the things that are, done on a mass scale today. So that is one thing to take into consideration, that in the Islamic viewpoint, we are held accountable before Allah in the next world, and it would affect us in this world as well. Sorry. Um, with respect to how we treat, interact with, and appreciate the blessings that Allah has given us. And indeed, another principle of the Quran is that we should be grateful for the divine blessings. And one of the ways of expressing gratitude is to look after them properly, and to use them wisely and appropriately and as necessary, but not to make light of them. It's related from Imam Sadiq, peace be upon him. Do not cut down fruit trees, for Allah will pour down punishment on you. That's a little bit scary too, if you think about it, because you do have this idea, throughout the Quran and Hadith, that there is a sort of metaphysical law of cause and effect. That is to say, it's not only that the physical cause and effect in situations in life that leads to a result, like I hit you and it hurts, for example, or I hit you and I go to jail. That's a very physical cause and effect. But a metaphysical cause and effect might also include the moral and ethical component. So if I am ungrateful to Allah, or how many times does it come up in the Quran? People, they get, some wealth and some self-sufficiency, and, they become very proud. They think nothing's going to ever happen to them. They're always going to have their, food supply and everything at Whole Foods and Amazon and etc. And then Allah says, no, ultimately I am the sustainer. You've had this, and it's been a sort of trial for you. We've seen how you've acted with these blessings, and now they're going to be taken away very quickly. I mean, God forbid. I'm not praying that anyone's blessings are taken away, but I'm just saying that, sometimes, when characteristic of the time we live in is we see ourselves as an exception to history. Some of us, anyway. And in some places, there's a sense that this is different from any other time. It's not going to be like any other time. But, you know, this is a story that the Quran repeats again and again. There's no reason why it shouldn't have some relationship to our time, just like it had a relationship to times past. So there is also a sort of metaphysical law and cause and effect, even though one could actually link the cutting down of trees to a physical cause and effect. I mean, there's plenty of just straightforward scientific physical cause and effect that relates to deforestation and the loss of greenery. And there's many physical benefits to the planting of greenery. However, there is, when speaking about Allah's punishment, if we take that directly, there is also something a bit beyond that. So that's two narrations. Well, I'll just add in one more for Barakah. The Prophet ﷺ said, "Do not hit animals on their faces, for they praise and glorify Allah." Again, that's pointing back to what we were talking about earlier. That from a traditional Islamic perspective, the fundamental nature of everything in being is its relationship with and an awareness of Allah. And again, if we are treating it with that level of respect and dignity, and also acknowledging that our fundamental nature is as a servant of Allah. Well, frankly, if we all thought that way, we wouldn't be having these problems, because we would be treating each other differently. We would be, mindful of the teachings about israf. We would be mindful about not trying to extort money out of people needlessly by making their phones stop working so well after the next software update or whatever it happens to be. But this obviously human nature has always been varied. This is not something new either in our era. But so in answer to your root question, we have authority, or so we have permission, I guess one can say, to enjoy the divine blessings in the world. But from an Islamic perspective, that doesn't mean that we're allowed to wantonly, destroy and do whatever we want. And in the hereafter, there is an accountability for what we do with it, just like for what we do with everything else. And you can't really separate the moral and ethical side of it, with the physical
Mm.
side.
Thank you for that answer. And yeah, I was just thinking while you were talking as well, on what you were saying, on how humans tend to overconsume when we talk about like animals and stuff like that. We always think we don't have enough. We need to get more, especially eating meat. Um, but is there a solution to that? Because deforestation is a lot. People need paper. People need to eat. But is there a solution to all this overconsumption? Would you say?
I'm going to ponder a bit on what you just said, that the human being always wants more. I mean, that is true. That is an aspect of human nature that has been recognized since ancient times. Sorry. Um, but that being said, to some degree, one could argue that perhaps the form of capitalism that has become prevalent in our era, which is based on continually driving growth and consumption, and needing that, in order to survive, has perhaps artificially increased a sense of need among people, or a fear of loss. It's hard to say 100%, but I mean, one kind of has to do one's best to historically project back. Like, I don't know if anyone here knows their great grandma or great grandpa, or great great or something. Most likely, unless they were very rich or something, they probably had less, and had less, less security. There's a sense of security, even if it's a false security, in knowing I can go to the grocery store and expect to find bread. I mean, might not be there, but there's an expectation, and yet there is still a deep-seated fear in a lot of people about not having. And I'm not trying to put anyone down. I do get, times are difficult. There are difficulties of living in, I don't know, whatever you want to call it, the first world, the global north, etc. And there's difficulties in living in different places, and it's not, I'm not saying people are, having quote unquote first world problems. There are, genuine needs and lacks, and a lot of people are living on the line. But I'm just kind of putting it out there is, there's also an artificial sense of need that has been pushed into us, and that has also led to changing social standards, which do, change the level of need, so to speak. If you think about something like clothing, I mean, back in the day, how much clothing did the average person in England have in 1800? Most people did not have very much, or say 1200, when you didn't have any sort of mechanization that I can think of offhand. You're making everything by hand. It's going to be, an expensive and, laborious product. But you know, because production has changed, availability has changed, we got the whole multinational corporation thing coming into it, etc. There is a social push to have different types of clothing for different occasions, and we haven't even gotten into social media yet. So now, a social push for people to get certain, different clothing for their Instagram shoots or whatever. But the point is, there is, in a sense, a need. If someone is trying to compete on an equal playing field with everyone else, it's simply, perhaps become a bit more about social status, but that can be a real thing if, say, people are competing for a high status job or something. But that need is not an inherent need. Perhaps, inshallah, what we are seeing is the deconstruction of some of the constructed needs, and going back to what are the genuine needs. And as for, I mean, as for what can be done, I mean, that's, like, I can talk to you about the religious side, the worldview, the Islamic side. I can talk to you about some things that I think maybe as Muslims we can do, in say, in our community centers. But as for the, big corporations, government policy, and to be honest, these are the areas which really need the most attention. There's only so much, say, I can do. I can't answer that because there's just so much going on there. There's so many agendas. And I think a lot of people, perhaps, or at least me, at least I'm kind of clueless. Why is it as human beings we can't get it together? We know we have a problem. What's the barrier here? Assuming there are people, say, 10,000 years later, they're going to look at us and say, they knew something was wrong, and why didn't they just do something about it? But we understand that maybe that's just the history of every social problem. When you try to do something about it, there's so much going on to block things. So that's a tough question. Maybe the next person you have on the podcast can give you a better answer to that part.
No, that's okay. No, I just thought of that on the spot, but it's fine. No, it is a tough question. There's so much going on. There's so much sort of like things in the world that's going on there. It's kind of hard to pinpoint what a solution could be. But just now, as a final question before we go on to our break, just circling back to Israf here, how are Quranic teachings on Israf, helpful in this situation when we talk about, plants and animals, consumption, that kind of thing?
Well, I do think that in general,
Mm.
big sort of qualification, in general, I think this is something Muslims tend to be mindful of. The idea that if we don't need something, we shouldn't buy it, or we shouldn't take it, or we should, if we have extra, we should share it with someone else. I know sometimes we can be a little bit like, what do you call it, reductionist or pedantic, like, eat that last spoonful of rice or it's israf. I mean, that's technically not how it works, because if you don't need it and you eat it, then that's israf anyway. But the point is that this sense that, we should enjoy Allah's blessings, but it is wrong to consume wastefully, and that we should try to avoid it, tends to be something instilled in many Muslims' minds. Unfortunately, of course, there is the culture of consumerism that has gone through some segments of the Muslim majority world, or Muslim majority populations in the Muslim minority world. It's obviously not everyone, but that glorification of a lavish lifestyle is there. Some people think that this is something that came from the West. I don't. I do think the roots of it are in human nature. But if you look back in Islamic history, I mean, you got people like, I'm sorry to say, but like Yazid, like, he's showing off the extravagant, wasteful, you know, lavish lifestyle on the backs of other people. So you can't say that people just invented that, say, in Europe in the 19th century, or America in the 20th century, or whatever. I mean, yeah, yes, that this idea has affected people in the West due to the way the economic system has been. But I'm just pointing out that we do know that it's there, and it's wrong. It's religiously wrong. It's something which is not beneficial to the planet, not beneficial to society, especially when there are very obvious inequities which are propping up that sort of lifestyle. And it is better to be a little bit more moderate. But in any case, nonetheless, by and large, we do tend to do well at that. And I think if we want to talk about Israf, and I mentioned it before, but an important value to bring in with that is gratitude. Keeping in mind that if we want to talk about, God forbid, kufr, kufr has a couple meanings. One of them is, being kafir, like, mocking Allah, and, God forbid, that all that stuff. But the Quran also speaks about kufr to Allah as being ingratitude to Allah. So if I have anything, a cup of water, a, I don't know, fancy coffee drink that you make me, whatever it is, if I'm grateful to Allah, grateful to you, grateful to, you know, whoever helped bring these things to me, etc., that's also an act of faith. And again, that affects how we handle these things. It's not going to be trashing it here and there. But if I'm ungrateful, or unmindful, theological component. So, gratitude and not doing israf do go very well together. I did mention the shaitan point, so I won't mention it again. But it's good to keep in mind that, when you do see mass consumption and consumerism that is destroying people's lives or destroying the planet, to keep in mind it is basically, Quranically described as evil. God.
I think Dr. Amina's cut out, unless that's just me. Um, let's just wait. She might come back. I swear, I
Something
think you
didn't
cut
like
out.
what I was saying.
I
We're
think you
getting
cut out for a
censored.
second. I thought it was me, so I was just going on Google to check whether it was me or not,
Mm.
see whether my Wi-Fi was working. But no, I think. Do you mind just repeating the last couple of sentences you said? I think we ended on evil. The Quran said
Yeah,
that
that's
is
kind of
evil.
depressing. So
Yeah.
inshallah, Imam Mahdi will come, and some people say
Mm,
when Imam Mahdi comes, I mean, one of the things that has been observed about the narrations of Akhir Zaman, and I'm not saying we live in Akhir Zaman because I think that's a conclusion people jump to very quickly, even if some of the
mm,
narrations do appear to be unusually true in our lifetimes. But nonetheless, we don't know. But environmental destruction, is implied at a number of the narrations,
mm,
as well as mass famine, and these things are associated with the Dajjal. That one reason people will follow the Dajjal is he'll give people the illusion that he's going to give them food, he's going to give them prosperity, and they chase after the Dajjal, and it just gets worse for them. But when the Mahdi comes, because we're skipping past the evil part
mm,
now, that he will of course be bringing so much knowledge that this will, it will solve the problems of the environment in the world, whatever they happen to be. I mean, I know people get all speculative about this, like will it be renewable energy or whatever. I mean, God knows best. It's not like specified. But that is a
yeah,
point for inshallah.
mm,
But yeah, as I was saying, the general idea of israf by and large tends to be there, even though perhaps it's good nonetheless to be mindful of how it's a move towards a more conspicuous consumption lifestyle is glorified in some circles or places or communities or groups. Just because if you think about how these ideas overtook, say, a place like the United States, which I think has suffered a lot from it, it's not like people were just born like that. I mean, yeah, there's the greed is part of the human nature, but people, if you will, they were naive, and there were any number of social changes that were introduced that were probably to benefit certain companies economically, and people just accepted them because they didn't really know what to think or how to think or what to question. As people, we just accept. So we should not just be accepting, we should be thinking, and this is one of the things we should be thinking about, inshallah.
inshallah. Thank you for that fantastic answer. And I was thinking about you said something about theological components, which I
Mm.
am excited to get to. But for now, we will stop for a short break. But audience, please don't go anywhere. We'll be right back for part two of today's episode titled Islam and the Environment. Can Islam help with our environmental crisis? So please stay tuned.
No home, no shelter, families ripped apart. Not sure who's still alive. No food, no livelihoods. Everything lost in an instant. A nightmare turned reality as monsoon rains turned deadly across Pakistan. Flash floods not seen in living memory have affected more than 30 million people, with Sindh, Baluchistan and Punjab most affected. More than 1,000 people have died, with millions having lost everything. The devastation is sudden and cataclysmic. A live emergency appeal is underway, as warnings of further devastation are forecast with more heavy rain expected. Please, donate whatever you can, no matter how small. This is an ongoing disaster. Whatever assistance is possible, visit donate.wf and help this desperately deteriorating situation. Thank you.
Welcome back to part two of your show, They Ask You, where we'll continue our discussion on Islam and the environmental crisis. Just as a reminder, as always, please do give us a like, comment, and share on all our social media pages. So now coming back to swiftly back to you, Dr. Amina. Next question about theology. So is there a theological component to how we treat the natural world? That is, does faith inspire people to treat nature or other human beings in a certain way? I know we touched on it before, but I think now we can sort of get more into the grassroots of it.
Absolutely, for sure. And I agree, we did touch on it before. Um, I do want to bring up something which, although it's been said before by people other than myself, I don't want it to come across as like insulting or us versus them or that sort of thing. But I'm just going to state it plainly because I think a lot of people and it's not even COVID. Um, a lot of people would agree, and eco-theology is is an endeavor in this day and age. Some people have identified the essential um, ideological or theological root of the environmental destruction we've seen in our time to a improper understanding of Christianity. I'm going to say improper because I don't believe this is what Jesus came to spread. But there was a certain idea. There were some, shall we say, bad plans that were supported by Christianity during the era of high imperialism. That's the colonialist era. It's apparently the polite term for it that I use now, but people don't always know what it means. Anyway, some of these bad ideas, we're a bit beyond them now, but whether or not all human beings are equal, racially speaking, that was one thing. Nature of women and men, and so forth. But one of these ideas that did not have good results was the idea that God gave Adam complete control over the earth because this is the human authority over the earth. Therefore, Adam can do whatever he wants with the earth, which we discussed that a bit from an Islamic perspective. Does the Islamic tradition allow us to do whatever you want? And that is essentially an outgrowth that does grow out of that idea, the sense of dominance of the human being. And one can plug that into what was going on in that era. I mean, when you have a worldview of dominance, whether it's Adam dominates the plants and animals because this is what God created him to do and gave him that divine stamp of authority, it's not a big stretch for Adam to go to, say, North Africa and start dominating there as well. And this is, there have been shifts in thoughts. That's why I'm saying this was a poor understanding of Christianity, a certain branch of Christianity. And this has, at least, I mean, I'm not like an expert on contemporary Christianity, but at least in some circles, there's a shift to a stewardship paradigm, which is, well, actually, God gave Adam the responsibility to look after the earth, not just the authority. But the idea was there. And that very much has led to this idea, which, incidentally, you don't actually find, in a lot of traditional cultures, that you can just treat, the trees and the earth and the plants and the crops and the animals as just your thing to do with what you will, to dominate them, if you will. As negative as sometimes some people are about the traditional religions, there is oftentimes, there's probably invariably a respect for the world people live in, because humanity would not have survived this far without that. So that is very much a theological aspect of the development of modern worldviews that has led, again, both to the environmental crisis and also other human crises as well that we have seen or we are seeing unfolding around us today. And so this is another example of one of the areas where you can see that religion is actually vital to um, to constructing, if you will, the way people think. Because even if people do not consider themselves religious in any way, anyone who's living in a society which has been influenced by these ideas in the past is still being affected by them. These ideas may no longer be transmitted in a religious context, but they're transmitted in popular culture or just a shared worldview and so forth. So that is one example of a theological problem which has been identified. That's why there is eco-theology. It is discussed, but it is there. As Muslims, I think that if we are taking an inherent look, or sort of I don't know, authentic look, whatever you want to call it, but we're taking it seriously, the actual contents of the Quran and Hadith, I think that this sort of thing would be sidestepped. It's not a natural idea to grow out of them because of the respect and importance given to things such as animals in the Quran. By the way, there's a book called that someone wrote. I haven't actually read all of it. I think it's called Animals in the Quran. But the point is, the Quran, although not a particularly long book, is quite respectful to animals. There's a concern over animals. The ant and Nabi Sulaiman, and will the ant get stepped on? And the hudhud has his job. The bees are inspired by Allah. I mean, think about it. I mean, I know some people might say that's just like linguistic, inspiring, but Allah inspires the prophets, and Allah's inspiring the bee. So there's again a very deep connection with the divine. Again, the birds are worshiping Allah. So the point being that there is a certain respect for the natural world that is very difficult if one is actually holding to those sources and paying attention to what all they say holistically and not just bits and pieces or whatever. It's difficult to go from that to a sort of full domination or destruction paradigm. That said, you did mention at the beginning that as Muslims, we don't necessarily hear about this topic a lot. And I think there is a lot of reasons for that. I mean, we could just sit here for hours, listing reasons. But I would say by and large, there are some areas of the Islamic heritage which have been somewhat neglected, probably, late 19th and then throughout the 20th century, because I don't know, because they weren't on people's minds, or they weren't convenient, or there were political reasons, or I mean, there were a lot of Islam has gone through a rough ride the past couple centuries. Again, I'm not blaming, but I'm just saying there was other stuff going on, and sometimes a desire to pick the things from the Islamic tradition which fit into certain contemporary viewpoints, which I guess it happens in every era. But even in my lifetime, I've seen how that has shifted. That there are certain, like when I was younger, the idea of the scientific proofs of the Quran was very popular, and the idea that you could somehow prove Islam by science. And then there's other issues that have become popular in this time, rather than maybe taking everything as a whole. So I do think this sort of thing has been pushed aside, but it is there, and so it's not something you necessarily need to dig or construct in the same way as if someone wants to make an argument that Islam is inherently
Mm.
democratic. Well, you kind of need to construct a bit because democracy, as we know it today, didn't exist in the past. But this is something which is seamless because we have always lived in the world, and the Quran speaks about the world and the creation of the world, and our relationship with the world and so forth. Um, so it's there, but there aren't a lot of people who have really brought it up. Sayyid Hossein Nasr is one of the people who has given this more attention than others. Um, his view, incidentally, and I know I'm rambling here. Do you want to interrupt at all?
No, carry on. I'm interested. I'm
Okay,
hooked on.
but his view, which very well could be correct, and he's lived through more time than I have, seen more, and so forth,
Mm.
is that one of the reasons this isn't an issue that Muslims have really, really developed in our, in our time. For example, Jomah Khutbahs, or the writings of great scholars. Not saying it hasn't been developed at all, but it's been a bit slow. Is the idea that he says that, if I'm paraphrasing him correctly, basically in the 20th century, there was so much focus on the West that there was the idea that progress and science and new ideas would all be coming from the West. And so, the environmental crisis was basically sparked by the West. I mean, I'm not going to say that right now we're at that position, but we'd want to talk about, who started using cars, en masse first and so forth. And so the idea was, well, the solution for that should come from the West. I guess a lack of self-confidence that we aren't going to be solving our own problems, or we can't. And then, of course, you had the whole political crisis in the Muslim world, Sykes-Picot. I wasn't allowed to say Sykes-Picot, by the way, last week. I was, I won't say who. I was censored. Apparently, that's a very inflammatory term, even though I bet half the viewers don't even know what it means. But, the breaking up of the
Yeah.
okay, the drawing of artificial boundary lines by the former European colonialist powers in certain regions. That was an adjustment. There were a lot of adjustments that had to go on, and so, it's there are a lot of reasons why Much of the Muslim majority world was not at the forefront. That said, today I think things have changed because it is such a pressing issue, and there may still be, political problems that do hold people back. But I mean, certainly, just on a human level, I know a lot of people, in a lot of countries who are trying, for example, permaculture, for example, and ways of building that can, be more sustainable and so forth. So it's there, but these are just some thoughts about what's been going on, and why we haven't necessarily heard as much about that as we might have heard about. I don't know, what do we even hear about nowadays? I'm a bit out of the loop. What's the hot topic we hear about in religious circles? Wait, do I want to know?
Yeah. um, it depends on the age group, I think. I think it
True,
depends
but
on the
that's
age
very
group.
true.
Yeah, I know a lot of like older age groups might have more like deeper discussions. Younger ones might be more like questionable. Because I'm a madrasa, I teach a madrasa, and the questions they have are very are quite funny. Some of them, it's a lot about like hell, but it
Well,
depends on the age group,
yeah,
I
it's
think.
nice that they care and they're asking questions. I think that's the important thing.
Yeah, I think so too. I had someone asking me, like, it was a question about they kicked something by accident and they asked if they would go to hell for that. And it was quite like, it was an interesting discussion to have with them, to be honest. And it was like quite eye-opening for them, which is nice. It's nice to see the youth quite,
Mm,
critical and like querying. But yeah,
definitely, I think that's an encouraging sign.
I think so too. And just on your answer, actually, we were just touching on about the long lists of why the environment isn't so popular in like among Muslims and Islam at the moment, which we will get onto that question in a bit. But for the question now, we were talking about Prophet Adam and Prophet Isa, and what would you say are the relationship between the prophets, and also the Imams with the natural world? Would you say?
Well, one thing we can look at is the account of Imam Hussein, peace be upon him. When you actually read like the Maqta literature and the Hadith, there is a well, let's just go to the basics here. According to the Hadith, some people may accept it or not accept it, understand it, not understand it. If any of us understand it, the earth would not survive without the Hujjat Allah. So you need the existence of the Hujjat Allah in the Ithna Ashari Shi'i view, in order for the subsistence of the natural world. So this is a little bit of a reverse of what we're trained to think in school today. We're trained to think that the universe is basically self-subsisting. Human being is just this speck, and if we're not here or whole Earth wasn't here, wouldn't be a big deal. Because it's just quantitatively it's so much bigger and can function perfectly fine without us. It's a little bit better without us, quite frankly, with how things are going. But on again a broader creational structure, according to what is narrated, that you do need the presence of, what some people might call the insan al kamil, but the Allah's authority and the perfect human, for creation as we know it to persist. So there is an inherent, again, metaphysical link between the spiritually elevated human, which in our understanding would be the prophet or the imam,
Mm,
as designated by the prophet, um, that's there. Um, but also, there is a sort of synergy between the Masum, the prophet or the imams, and the natural world. So, for example, both in the Sunni and Shi'i sources, we've all heard this. I know, that when Imam Hussein is martyred, um, you know the uh, the sky is weeping. The sky is eclipsed. The sky is weeping for 40 days. The rivers are running red. The sun is, sorry, I said the sky is eclipsed. The sun is eclipsed, and the sky is red. So there are these immediate natural signs surrounding the martyrdom of Imam Hussein, peace be upon him. If you recite Ziyarat Nahia, for example, it speaks about the grief of all sorts of things in the world over the martyrdom of Imam Hussein. Whether it's the fish or the trees and so forth. In fact, if you read Common Ziyarat, you find chapters on the awareness and mourning over Imam Hussein from various categories of created beings. So, for example, the pigeons are sending la'na on the killers of Imam Hussein. Do you know how many pigeons we have in London? You may know how many pigeons we have. That's a lot of la'na going on.
Yeah.
But that's a specific chapter, and the owls who are mourning Imam Hussein. That's a specific chapter. So there is this this link and a sense between the prophets and the imams and the natural world. Part of Twelver Shi'i belief, I'm just clarifying this because Muslims do have various strands of beliefs, and other Muslims might accept this or not, depending on their strand of belief. It is also believed that any capacity that the previous prophets had is inherited by the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the imams. So, for example, speaking to animals, that would be a capability that is inherited by them. So again, there is a link and an understanding, and you do actually see that in the Maqta literature. Imam Hussein is speaking with his horse, um, but smiling because someone once told me off at work for speaking to my houseplants. Anyway, but it's okay to do if you're a prophet or imam. So I'm just like
Yeah.
following the sunnah. But the point is,
Mm.
there's an understanding and awareness there, and an empathy. The natural world is never on the wrong side with these things. You could have a debate for a long time about what is the nature of nature. Is it good? Is it evil? Is it morally neutral? But it's never on the wrong side when it comes to Imam Hussein. You don't see like cats, for example, siding with Yazid.
Mm.
So they are portrayed as being innately linked to the to the cosmos, to the earth, and to the creations. So that in and of itself is very telling when it comes to the Islamic worldview. It is something that is reinforced when one listens to these stories. But again, sometimes we don't always like stop to think about it. We just hear it and we take it for granted. So sometimes it helps to point it out.
Yeah. Thank you for that answer. And yeah, I'm completely on board with you there. And I was also thinking in my head, when we were talking about prophets and imams, of course, with the martyrdom of Imam Hussein, but also they followed, the like you said, the Quranic teachings and hadiths of how we must treat the natural world. And I think that also brings me on to my next question about the people nowadays in modern era. Like we said before, people feel more disconnected from the natural world, but our prophets and imams were more obviously more connected to the natural world. So we always try our best to follow in their akhlaq, their characteristics, their teachings. But why, when it comes to this, is it more of like we're more disconnected in a way? Would you say?
I think the main factor is urbanization. Um,
Mm.
and of course, this is it's a mixed bag. I mean, it's attributed to Imam Ali, peace be upon him, that he advised people to live in the cities because they have a better Islamic culture. So their cities have had a function historically, and the countryside has had a function. We can't live without the countryside, and we can't live without agriculture. I mean, we could live
Yeah.
without cities. Well, not with this population, we can't, but we wouldn't have many of the things we do have as human beings, because the city, it
Mm.
exports science and culture and technology and new political systems and everything else. Um, but this is the first time in history we've just had so many people grow up in an urban environment without the experience of basically growing your food, raising animals, or seeing natural things. And it can be really striking how how disconnected people can be. I sometimes look at the New Crescent Society social media feed, and they had a post. I think it was the beginning or the end of the month of Ramadan, that apparently people were sending in moon sighting photos that weren't actually the moon. It's like, that's its
Really?
basics. Like I do get, the UK is cloudy, there's light pollution. You're not gonna maybe you don't know the constellations and so forth, but the moon is a basic.
Yeah.
But a lot of people, especially younger people, and to be honest, they don't look at the moon because first of all, you've got light pollution, you've got buildings in the way, and then there's generally unfortunately a fear of going outside at night. So people don't want their children
Mm.
to go outside. So when are they going to see this basic aspect of the natural world? Are things like oh dear, I feel like it's soapbox time. Like salat times. Back in the day, like I don't know, 1500s or whatever. But back in the day, there were all sorts of ways to calculate your salat times that didn't involve an app, that somehow involved cognizance of the fact that Fajr is, first dawn, or, first real dawn. Maghrib is sunset and being linked to that. I'm not saying people are not linked to that, especially again in places with a sort of extreme uh, night or day length. You're sometimes very aware of the fact that it's light or dark. But I do feel like that gets lost when there is more reliance on basically a machine to tell you, point me and I will show you the qibla, type in where you are and I will tell you your salat times. Even though the link is there, it somehow dims it. So I think a lot of it just has to do with, yeah, urbanization and, sorry to say, but the development of a virtual culture. And I'm not trying to be negative about the internet entirely. I am one of those people who
Mm.
has lived, through the development of the internet, and it's had good and bad. But one thing I have seen is, people have gone to actually doing things and experiencing things because that was all you could do. You didn't have like a virtual experience available to simulating things or interacting with the world primarily through a screen. And not everyone, of course, but that is a trend, and there's a lot of reasons why it is like that. And sometimes we just don't really have a choice anymore. But I think that also disconnects people from what is actually happening. When there is a sort of more of a push for a virtual existence or a screen existence. Of course, we're having one right now, so I can't complain.
It's okay. No, I really like that answer actually, and I think like I was thinking when I was reading this question, like, what is it? What is this issue that people aren't, that are connected anymore? And it's definitely urbanization. That times are very different to how things used to be. We have a lot more things, a lot more, I guess, obstacles in the way of, um, appreciating the natural world that we have. So that actually leads me on to my final question. You know, what can, if you can summarize in just a few sentences, what can mosques and Islamic centers, do to try maybe influence our youth, nowadays to be more aware of the natural world, but also to try reduce our environmental impact, if you could summarize.
Yeah, to be fair, I think the awareness is there among youth. I mean, I don't know
Mm,
like about all youth, but I find it in general, regardless of religious affiliation in general, I think the generations that are coming up are much more acutely aware of this, and probably just because they've been raised and educated to be more aware. Whereas, you, you know, say in my generation, it was mentioned also, but I think maybe the older generations, even though it was known that this is a problem, that the sort of global culture of considering it wasn't there.
mm,
Sorry. So, but of course, definitely it is good to raise awareness of these topics on platforms such as this. And also, as I think you might have been implying, raising awareness that it is our topic, so to speak, as well. It's not just something belonging to the secular world or the policymakers or the UN or whatever, but that our faith tradition does have things to say about it. So that is one thing. As for mosques, I think it's good to look at places that are doing things well, and look at things to copy, places, for example, that have reduced what is basically unnecessary waste. Especially we understand that at certain times of the year there's a lot of styrofoam that's used, or some places use foil take-home containers. And it's interesting how all of these subjects kind of combine. Like when you were mentioning a few things about urbanization as well, I was thinking about how many other ways that has changed. The rapid urbanization has changed society. For one thing, so many people moving away from their roots, or their family, or their friends, and in places where you move frequently. It's caused a sort of individualization of society that also wasn't there in the past, for better or for worse. I'm not going to paint everything with the same brush. Um, but that's also the difference between eating communally, like people would have done in the past, like if you serve them on a plate or from a bowl, and then you sat there and you talked and bonded and acted like a community, so to speak. Versus it is convenient to give someone a takeaway container, and maybe they don't want to eat then, and I can completely understand. I went to a majlis that ended at like 1 something in the morning. Honestly, I don't want to eat it that time of day. I mean, I'm fine to
yeah.
refuse the food, but the point is, I get that there's advantages and convenience factors, and sometimes there's some practical reasons why maybe people would like to do something differently that they can't. Um, but it's reflective of the broader social changes as well. And I do think anything we can do to try to improve community spirit and human bonding among people in a face-to-face situation is good in our times because especially in bigger cities, again, that is sometimes lacking depending on where you are. Might not be lacking where you are. But yeah, so looking at practices that are working well, I've heard all sorts of glowing things about the eco mosque in
Oh,
Cambridge.
yeah, I've heard of that too. Yeah, was it in Cambridge?
Yeah, so I
Yeah,
I, I think it is, which is really
yeah.
bad because I was there a couple weeks ago.
Oh,
Like
okay, okay. Then
you
I
know.
then you know more than me then.
Yeah, but I think it's just sometimes my brain gets confused.
That's
Anyway,
okay. Yeah,
but as I was saying, look at what they're doing and look at what is doable. I mean, sometimes you
mm,
want to do things and you can't. Even something as simple as recycling. I mean, it recycling doesn't solve all the world's problems. There's any number of additional problems added in when you start recycling, but it is something. But sometimes you just can't because the facilities aren't there, or the point is you do need outside support. So maybe a government support or some sort of infrastructure to do things. But to do what one can to at least I think to reduce waste in food related things is a good one. I think looking at sustainable ways of handling Hajj and Ziyarat is another important one, and there are people looking into that. I'm not saying that they're not, but when you have those mass numbers of people and a lot of travel, and I'm not saying people shouldn't travel, but I'm saying just take it into consideration. It's a completely different situation in the 21st century. Everyone coming on airplanes and disposable water bottles and whatnot than it was when people were showing up on a ship and maybe eating in a normal way, carrying their own water container
mm,
and so forth. And inshallah, we will do that. But those are, some key areas that we can look at. And I'm also sure that, the more environmentally sustainable we make these activities, the more enjoyable they will be spiritually and also on a human level as well. No one likes to see a sort of trashed earth, and no one likes to
mm.
feel sort of that sense of disconnect. So inshallah, um, if we get things together, we will have a brighter and more enjoyable future.
Son, thank you for that answer. And yeah, I really picked up on the point where you said more face-to-face interactions. Because of lockdown, we've all been, in our homes, but alhamdulillah, now we're kind of out of that. Going to mosque, madrasa, that kind of thing, especially for our youth, because I know some of um, the madrasa children, they haven't seen each other since they were in like class one, and now they're in about class
Wow.
three. So they
Yeah.
haven't really had interaction with each other, social interaction. So it's important for that to carry on, and also all
Alhamdulillah.
in a sustainable and eco-friendly way.
Yeah.
Alhamdulillah.
Yeah.
Yeah. But thank you very much, Dr. Amina. Yeah, it was in Cambridge. I don't know why in my head I was thinking it's in London. But yeah,
Inshallah,
uh,
maybe it will be in London.
inshallah, that'd be great. That'd be fantastic. But yeah, thank you very much today. Unfortunately, at this point, we have come to the end of our show. I'd like to thank you, Dr. Amina, so much for gracing and enlightening us with your precious time, your knowledge, and I'm sure the audience, as well as myself, have really taken a lot away from this interesting episode. Inshallah, we can use these sustainable and eco-friendly in our lives when we go to mosque or just any general way. Each small thing that we do will make a huge impact. So inshallah, we can pick up and it'll have a profound impact on our daily lives. We're also very grateful for the rest of the hardworking team behind the scenes for facilitating this live show. And last but certainly not least, I would like to thank you, the viewers, for dedicating your Sunday afternoon and tuning into the show and also leaving some comments and queries for us. Jazakumullah khair to all of you. If you liked today's episode, don't worry. Inshallah, we will have another one lined up for you next week. So please tune in for that at 4 p.m. UK time on Blessed Tree Media YouTube channel. As always, please do follow us on social media, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube to see any shows or upcoming events. And this is all at Blessed Tree Media. And do give us a like, comment, and share. This has been Mohamed Abbas Kirmani, and this is Blessed Tree Media, bidding you all farewell. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.